The tape gun screeched across the cardboard flaps, a harsh tear in the silence of the garage. Richard pressed his palm down on the brown strip, smoothing it out. One box done. 40 years to go. He didn't look up when the screen door slammed. He knew the rhythm of those footsteps. Heavy, impatient boots. That was Mark. Sharp, clicking heels against the concrete. Susan. "The truck is here, Dad," Mark said. He stood in the sliver of sunlight cutting through the open bay door, checking his phone. "Movers are charging by the hour. We need to stage everything in the driveway." Richard nodded, lifting the box. It was heavy, filled with mismatched tools and jars of rusted nails he promised he'd use one day. "Grab the cooler," Richard said, his voice raspy from breathing in dust since dawn. "Don't let the ice melt." Susan walked past him, running a manicured finger along the dusty workbench. She stopped at the outline of a vice grip that had been removed hours ago. "Are you taking the old filing cabinet?" she asked, pointing to the dented metal grey tower in the corner. "It smells like oil. The new apartment is small, Dad. You don't need this junk." "It's not junk," Richard grunted, setting the box down by the tire of his 2012 Silverado. "Important papers." "Mom kept the important papers in the study," Susan countered, her tone sharpening. "This is just garage stuff. Receipts from 1990, manuals for lawnmowers we don't own anymore." She grabbed the handle of the top drawer. It was locked. "Leave it, Susan," Richard said. He didn't shout, but the command was absolute. She pulled harder, the metal rattling. "Jesus, why is it locked? What are you hiding in here? The reason you missed my graduation." The air in the garage grew thin. Mark looked up from his phone. Richard stood still, his hands hanging loosely by his sides, covered in grease and dust. He didn't answer. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass keyring. "Open it," Richard said, tossing the keys to Mark. "If you're so sure it's trash, throw it out." This is a story about the hidden costs of providing for a family. Before we follow Richard and his children into this difficult night, please subscribe to the channel and like this video if you understand the weight of silent sacrifice. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Mark caught the keys. He looked at his father, then at the cabinet. The tension wasn't new. It was a stale, lingering thing that had lived in this house for 30 years. Mark inserted the key. The lock tumbled with a heavy clunk. He pulled the drawer open. It didn't slide smoothly. The rails were rusted. Inside there were no manuals or oily rags. There was only a single thick accounting ledger with a red spine and a stack of envelopes bound by a rubber band so old it had calcified and snapped as soon as Mark touched it. "Well?" Susan crossed her arms. "What is it?" Mark picked up the first envelope. It wasn't a letter. It was a foreclosure notice from the bank, dated October 14th, 1998. The font was red and aggressive. Final notice. Eviction scheduled. "I don't remember this," Mark whispered, frowning. 1998. I was in high school. We went to Disney World that year. Susan scoffed, walking over to peer over his shoulder. "Don't be dramatic. Mom handled the bills. We never had money trouble. Mom was amazing with the budget." Mark handed her the paper. Susan read it, her eyes narrowing. "This says, account current. But look at the date on the stamp. It was paid 2 days before the deadline." Mark reached for the red ledger. He opened it to the middle. The handwriting wasn't their mother's flowing cursive. It was Richard's blocky, jagged print. Date, Oct. 15, 1998. Received 4200. Source, night shift, loading dock. Date, Oct. 16, 1998. Paid, Bank of America. Balance, $0. Mark turned the page. The entries didn't stop. Novi, 1998. Orthodontist for Susan. Cost, $3,500. Source, Weekend Hall, Scrap Copper Deck 1998. Christmas gifts. Cost, $600. Source, Overtime, third shift security. The garage was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Susan stared at the page. "That's not right," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "You worked at the plant, Dad. 9 to 5. Mom said you stayed late drinking with the guys. She said you needed space from us." Richard didn't look at them. He picked up a roll of packing tape. "The plant cut hours in '97, he said to the wall. "They didn't tell the wives, didn't want to panic the town." "You were gone every night until 10, Susan said, the accusation losing its steam, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable horror. "Mom cried. She told us you loved your work more than you loved coming home to dinner." "I loved that you had dinner to eat," Richard said flatly. He ripped a strip of tape with his teeth. Mark kept flipping through the ledger. It went on for years. Every major expense, Susan's college tuition, Mark's first car, the funeral costs for Laura, was logged on the left. On the right, the source was never savings. It was always side job, night shift, sale of Grandpa's watch. "Mum didn't know?" Mark asked, looking up. The hostility was gone from his face, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable horror. "She knew we were afloat," Richard said. He walked over to the cabinet and took the ledger from Mark's hands, closing it with a thud. "She didn't need to know how heavy the boat was. She had enough to worry about with her health." "But she blamed you," Susan whispered. "She told us. She let us believe you were just absentee. Why didn't you correct her? Why didn't you tell us?" Richard looked at his daughter. For the first time, his eyes looked tired, not just from the dust, but from decades of holding up a ceiling that his family thought was naturally suspended by gravity. "A man does what he has to do," Richard said. "You don't ask for a thank you for keeping the roof up. You just keep it up." He turned back to the Silverado. "Truck's waiting. Let's load the sofa." But the air had changed. The anger that Susan had nursed for 20 years, the resentment that fueled her therapy sessions, had just hit a wall of concrete reality. She looked at the foreclosure notice in her hand. The paper was yellowed, brittle. "Dad," she started, but the sound of a heavy diesel engine cut her off. A large white truck was backing up the driveway. Richard walked out into the sunlight to guide the driver. Susan and Mark stood in the dark garage, the smell of old oil suddenly smelling like something else entirely, like sweat and exhaustion. "He sold his watch," Mark murmured, staring at the closed ledger. "He told me he lost it fishing." "We need to talk to him," Susan said. "Not yet," Mark replied, watching their father through the open door. Richard was signaling the driver, his movements precise, authoritative. "He's working. Let him finish the job." The physical labor of moving a life accumulated over 40 years does not allow for long pauses. The emotional shock of the ledger had to be shelved, tucked away like the boxes stacked in the hallway. The clock was ticking on the mover's hourly rate. Mark stepped back into the garage, his demeanor altered. He didn't check his phone. He walked straight to the washing machine, a heavy Whirlpool unit from the early 2000s that Richard was insisting on taking to the new apartment. "Grab the dolly," Mark said to one of the movers, a young kid with tattoos on his neck. "I'll take the back. It's heavy." Richard moved to intervene. "I can guide it down the—" "I said I got it, Dad," Mark interrupted. His voice wasn't angry. It was thick, grounded. He maneuvered the dolly with a newfound aggression, sweating through his polo shirt. He was handling the weight because he suddenly understood how much weight had been carried for him. Susan stayed in the kitchen. She was wrapping drinking glasses in newspaper. Her movements were mechanical. Wrap, tuck, place. She glanced through the pass-through window into the living room. The carpet was a different color, where the sofa had been. A rectangle of pristine beige surrounded by sun-faded gray. Richard walked in, carrying a toolbox. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply set the toolbox down and opened the refrigerator, pulling out 3 water bottles. He cracked the seal on one and slid it across the counter to her. "Hydrate," he said. "It's hot today." Susan looked at the bottle. "The orthodontist," she said, not looking up. "Sophomore year. I wanted braces because Jenny Miller called me Bucky. Mom said she saved up from the grocery budget." Richard took a long sip of water. She did save. She saved what she could. The ledger said, "Scrap copper, weekend haul." Susan pressed, finally meeting his eyes. You spent every Saturday that year claiming you were helping Uncle Mike fix up his cabin. I hated you for that. I told everyone my dad preferred his brother to his daughter. Richard set his bottle down. Mike didn't have a cabin. He had a pickup truck and a permit to salvage wire from the demolished textile plant in Ridley. It was dirty work, not something a teenage girl needs to hear about. I'm 38, Dad. You were 15 then, Richard replied, his voice closing the subject like a heavy door. And you got the smile you wanted. He turned to leave, but the front doorbell rang. The chime echoed hollowly in the emptying house. It was Mr. Henderson from across the street. He was leaning on a cane, holding a Pyrex dish covered in aluminum foil. Henderson was 75, a man who measured the neighborhood's history by the cars in the driveways. Saw the truck, Henderson said, stepping onto the porch. Martha made lasagna. Figured you wouldn't have the stove on. Thanks, Jim, Richard said, taking the dish. You didn't have to. Henderson looked past Richard to Mark, who was wiping sweat from his forehead. You kids taking care of him? Henderson asked, his tone joking but his eyes sharp. We're trying, Mark said. Good, Henderson nodded. He's earned a rest. I still don't know how you did it, Rich. Double shifts at the warehouse in '09 and then coming home to fix my roof that weekend after the storm. I got tired just watching you. Mark froze. Warehouse? In 2009? Richard shot Henderson a look, a subtle, sharp narrowing of the eyes. Henderson caught it and coughed, shifting his weight. Well, you know, the work, whatever it was, he was always working. Henderson tapped the doorframe. Don't be a stranger, Rich. Enjoy the condo. He turned and shuffled down the walk. Mark walked over to his father. The year 2009 hung in the air. 2009, Mark said slowly. That was the year I got the DUI. The lawyer cost $5,000. You told me you dipped into your 401k. Richard picked up the lasagna. Lunchtime, let's eat before this gets cold. Dad, Mark said, stepping in front of him, you were working a second job at a warehouse at age 55 to pay for my mistake? It was a mistake, Richard said, his jaw tight. You were a kid. You needed a clean record to get that engineering job. I needed a lesson! Mark's voice rose, cracking. I thought you just paid it off like it was nothing. I thought we had endless money. And you got the job, Richard said, pointing a finger at Mark's chest. You have a career. You have a house. You have 2 kids who sleep soundly at night. That's what matters. Now sit down and eat. They sat on the floor of the living room, legs crossed, eating lasagna with plastic forks. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was vibrating with the energy of recalibration. Susan and Mark were replaying their entire childhoods, overlaying the new data onto old memories. Every absence, every missed soccer game, every time Richard fell asleep in the recliner at 7 p.m., it all looked different now. Susan put her fork down. She reached for her purse and pulled out the closing folder, the documents from the house sale that had finalized that morning. Okay, she said, trying to pivot to practical matters. Let's talk about the new place. The condo in Heritage Park is nice, Dad. Small but low maintenance. And with the check from this house, you'll have plenty of cushion. She opened the folder to check the numbers. She wanted to see the big number. The house was in a prime market. It sold for $455,000. After the mortgage payoff, there should be at least $300,000 in equity. A comfortable retirement. Susan scanned the HUD-1 settlement statement. Her finger traced down the lines. Sales price, $455,000. Mortgage payoff. Principal, $210,000. Liens, judgments, 0. Home equity line of credit. Payoff, $230,000. Susan stopped. She blinked. Dad? Richard was chewing slowly, looking out the window at the oak tree in the front yard. Dad! Susan repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. What is this HELOC? $230,000. Mark leaned in, snatching the paper. That can't be right. The house was almost paid off. Mom threw a mortgage burning party in 2005. Look at the bottom line, Susan said. Mark looked. Cash to seller, $4,105. The room seemed to tilt. The nest egg wasn't there. There was no cushion. There was $4,000 and a Social Security check. Where did the money go? Mark asked. The aggression was gone, replaced by fear. Dad, that's $250,000. Were you gambling? Was it a scam? Richard put his plate down on the floor. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, folding it neatly into a square. He looked at his children, really looked at them, assessing if they were strong enough to carry the last box. Mum's treatments, Richard said softly. Susan shook her head. Insurance covered the chemo. We saw the bills. Insurance covered the standard protocol, Richard said. It didn't cover the clinical trials in Houston. It didn't cover the in-home care during the last 6 months, so she wouldn't have to go to a hospice facility. She wanted to die in her own bedroom. She wanted you two to remember her strong, not hooked up to machines in a hospital. He gestured around the empty room. I took out the equity line in 2018. It bought her dignity. It bought her peace. You spent everything? Susan choked out, tears finally spilling over. You have nothing left? I have my truck, Richard said, standing up. His knees cracked, loud in the silent room. I have my tools, and I have 2 children who turned out decent. He walked toward the foyer, picking up his keys. The movers are waiting on the master bedroom set. I can't pay them for overtime. Mark and Susan sat on the floor, the settlement statement lying between them like a grenade that had already gone off. The realization hit them simultaneously. Their father wasn't just moving to a smaller condo because he was old. He was moving because he was destitute. He had liquidated his entire life, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, to pave the road they were walking on. Mark looked at the door where his father had exited. The silhouette of the man against the bright afternoon sun looked thinner than he remembered, but stronger than he could comprehend. He's broke, Mark whispered. He's completely broke. No, Susan said, wiping her face and standing up. Her heels clicked sharply on the hardwood, a sound of resolve. No, he isn't. She reached for her phone, but Mark grabbed her wrist. Don't, Mark said. Don't you dare offer him money right now. He'll walk out and never speak to us again. You know how he is. So what do we do? Susan hissed. Let him live in that shoebox eating canned beans? We help him finish the job, Mark said, standing up. And then we look at the ledger. Mark walked to the garage but stopped at the doorway. He turned back to Susan. There's one more thing in that cabinet, Mark said. I saw it when I grabbed the ledger, a blue envelope, sealed. What is it? It says, for Richard. Open when I'm gone. It's from Mom. The seal is broken. He read it? I don't think so, Mark said. I think he opened it but couldn't bring himself to read it. The paper inside looks crisp, untouched. The master bedroom was the last to be dismantled. The outline of the headboard was ghosted onto the paint, a rectangle of slightly brighter cream against the aged walls. Richard stood by the window, watching the movers wrestle the mattress down the hall. He looked like a captain whose ship had been stripped for parts. Mark walked in, the blue envelope in his hand. He didn't offer a preamble. He simply held it out. You need to read this, Dad, before we lock the door. Richard stared at the handwriting. For Richard. I know what it says, he said, his voice rough. It says I wasn't there. It says I missed the concerts and the dinners. Read it, Susan said from the doorway. She was holding the red ledger against her chest like a shield. Richard took the envelope. His fingers, thickened by years of handling lumber and steel, struggled with the delicate paper. He pulled out a single sheet of lined stationery. He read in silence. His face remained still, but his throat worked, swallowing hard against something rising. My dearest Richard, I know you worry about the numbers. I hear you pacing at 2 a.m. I see the receipts you hide in your boots. You think you're invisible, that I only see the empty chair at dinner. But I see the roof that doesn't leak. I see the tuition checks clearing. I see the medicine on my nightstand. You think love is sitting on the couch, holding hands. And it is. But love is also the night shift. Love is the overtime. You carried the weight of the world so I could have the strength to hold our children. You didn't miss our life, Richard. You made it possible. Please, when you read this, put the hammer down. Rest. You did a good job. Richard lowered the paper. He didn't cry. Men like Richard didn't weep openly. He simply took a deep, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it since 1998. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, directly over his heart. "She knew," he whispered, "the whole time." "She knew," Susan said, stepping forward to squeeze his arm. "And now, we know." Thank you for listening this far. If this story resonates with you and you're thinking of a parent who showed love through sacrifice, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us tell more stories like this. Now, Tim. The sun was setting by the time the last box was unloaded at the new condo in Heritage Park. The apartment was clean, modern, and sterile. It was half the size of the house they had left. The movers left. The silence of the new place was different. It didn't have the creaks and groans of the family home. It felt temporary. Richard sat on a folding chair in the center of the small living room. He looked exhausted, his shoulders finally slumping under the gravity of the day. "Well," Richard said, looking at the stack of boxes, "it's done. I've got soup in the pantry. You two should get home to your families." Mark was standing by the bookshelf, the only piece of furniture they had prioritized setting up. He took the red ledger from Susan. "Not yet," Mark said. He walked over to the kitchen counter, grabbed a pen, and opened the book to the very last page. The spine cracked. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, frowning. "That book is closed. Accounts are settled." "Not this one," Mark said. He wrote firmly, the pen scratching loud in the quiet room. He walked over to the bookshelf and placed the ledger on the highest shelf, right next to the framed photo of Laura. Richard stood up and walked to the shelf. He peered at the new entry Mark had written in his bold engineer's script. Date, today. Item, Richard's retirement and security. Cost, whatever is required. Source, the Miller children. Richard stared at the words. He looked at Mark, then at Susan. He opened his mouth to object, to say he didn't need charity, that he could manage on Social Security. Susan stepped in before he could speak. She picked up the toolbox Richard had carried in. "Mark handles the finances now, Dad," she said, her voice light but firm. "I handle the logistics. That's the new deal." She popped the latch on the toolbox. "Now, this TV isn't going to mount itself on the wall. Which drill bit do I need?" Richard looked at his daughter holding his Makita drill. He looked at his son, who was already breaking down the cardboard boxes, organizing the recycling just the way Richard had taught him. The burden had shifted. The roof was being held up by new pillars. Richard reached into the toolbox and pulled out a Phillips head bit. He handed it to Susan. "Start with a pilot hole," Richard said, his voice steady, "and use the stud finder. Do it right." "We will, Dad," Mark said, flattening a box. "We'll do it right." Richard sat back down in the folding chair, watching them work. He took the letter out of his pocket, ran his thumb over the crease, and for the first time in 40 years, he leaned back and closed his eyes. "Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this powerful story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to keep sharing moments like this with our community. If you want to keep feeling these stories, start a marathon with our most loved narratives. Some videos are appearing on your screen right now. Click on one of them and continue this journey with us. A warm hug, and may God bless your home and your family. See you in the next video.